3. In seeking a more substantial definition of what appears in Proust's Mémoire de l'intelligence as a byproduct of Bergson's theory, we would do well to go back to Freud. In 1921, Freud published his essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which hypothesizes a correlation between memory, in the sense of mémoire involontaire, and consciousness. The following remarks, though based on that essay, are not intended to confirm it. We shall have to content ourselves with testing the fruitfulness of Freud's hypothesis in situations far removed from the ones he had in mind when he wrote. Such situations are more likely to have been familiar to Freud's pupils. Some of Reich's writings on his own theory of memory are in line with Proust's distinction between involuntary and voluntary recollection. The function of memory, Gedächtnis, Reich writes, is to protect our impressions. Reminiscence, and Erinnerung, aims at their dissolution. Memory is essentially conservative, reminiscence destructive. End quote. Freud's fundamental thought, on which these remarks are based, is the assumption that emerging consciousness takes the place of a memory trace. Therefore, it would be the special characteristic of consciousness that, unlike what happens in all other systems of the psyche, the excitatory process does not leave behind a permanent change in its elements, but expires, as it were, in the phenomenon of being conscious, of becoming conscious. End quote. The basic formula of this hypothesis is that becoming conscious and leaving behind a memory trace are incompatible processes within one and the same system. End quote. Rather, vestiges of memory are often most powerful and most enduring when the incident which left them behind was one that never entered consciousness. Put in Proustian terms, this means that only what has not been experienced explicitly and consciously, what has not happened to the subject as an isolated experience, Erlebnis, can become a component of mémoire involontaire. According to Freud, the attribution of permanent traces as the basis of memory, the processes of stimulation, is reserved for other systems, which must be thought of as different from consciousness. In Freud's view, consciousness as such receives no memory traces whatever, but has another important function, protection against stimuli. For the living organism, protection against stimuli is almost more important than the reception of stimuli. The protective shield is equipped with its own store of energy and must above all strive to preserve the special forms of conversion of energy operating in it against the effects of the excessive energies at work in the external world, effects that tend toward an equalization of potential and hence towards destruction. End quote. The threat posed by these energies is the threat of shocks. The more readily consciousness registers these shocks, the less likely they are to have a traumatic effect. Psychoanalytic theory strives to understand the nature of these traumatic shocks in terms of how they break through the shield that protects against stimuli. According to this theory, fright gains significance in proportion to the absence of any preparedness for anxiety. Freud's investigation was occasioned by the sort of dream that may afflict accident survivors, those who develop neuroses which cause them to live the catastrophe in which they were involved. Dreams of this kind, according to Freud, endeavor to master the stimulus retroactively by developing the anxiety whose emission was the cause of the traumatic neurosis. Valéry seems to have had something similar in mind. The coincidence is worth noting, for Valéry was among those interested in the special functioning of psychic mechanisms under present-day conditions. Moreover, Valéry was able to reconcile this interest with his poetic production, which remained exclusively lyric. He thus emerges as the only author who goes back directly to Baudelaire. Quote, the impressions and sense perceptions of humans, Valéry writes, actually belong in the category of surprises. They are evidence of an insufficiency in humans. Recollection is an elemental phenomenon which aims at giving us the time for organizing the reception of stimuli which we initially lacked. End quote. The reception of shocks is facilitated by training in coping with stimuli. If need be, dreams as well as recollection may be enlisted. As a rule, however, so Freud assumes, this training devolves upon the wakeful consciousness, located in a part of the cortex which is so frayed by the effect of the stimulus that it offers the most favorable situation for the reception of stimuli. Thus, the shock is thus cushioned, parried by consciousness. That the shock is thus cushioned, parried by consciousness, would lend the incident that occasions it the character of an isolated experience, Erlebnis, in the strict sense. If it were incorporated directly in the register of conscious memory, it would sterilize this incident for poetic experience, Erfahrung. One wonders how lyric poetry can be grounded in experience, eine Erfahrung, for which exposure to shock, Schocherlebnis, has become the norm. One would expect such poetry to have a large measure of consciousness. It would suggest that a plan was at work in its composition. This is indeed true of Baudelaire's poetry. It establishes a connection between him and Poe, among his predecessors, and with Valéry, among his successors. Proust and Valéry's reflections on Baudelaire complement each other providentially. Proust wrote an essay on Baudelaire, which is actually surpassed in significance by certain reflections in his novels. In his Situation de Baudelaire, Valéry supplies the classic introduction to Le Flux du Mal. Baudelaire's problem, he writes, must have posed itself in these terms: how to be a great poet, when neither a Lamartine nor a Hugo nor a Musset. I do not say that this ambition was consciously formulated, but it must have been latent in Baudelaire's mind. It even constituted the essential Baudelaire. It was his raison d'etat. There is something odd about referring to reason of state in the case of a poet. There is something remarkable about it, the emancipation from isolated experiences, erlebnisse. Baudelaire's poetic production is assigned a mission. Blank spaces hovered before him, and into these he inserted his poems. His work cannot be categorized merely as historical, like anyone else's, but it intended to be so and understood itself as such.